friends, this is Rick, and you're at your seat at the table. This is the Imperial Sourcebook from West End Games, part of the original first edition of the Star Wars role-playing game system. This would have been one of the early source books, like the third or fourth that came out in the series, and maybe a little later than that. I could be a little vague on this, but this was a great edition, and I have read this thing numerous times over the years, just for the source material, just to read what's in there, for the enjoyment of reading it. This would have been the first edition print when it came out, and I purchased this source book for $18. Yes, I did. $18. It's probably be $50 or $40 or something by today's standards. It's crazy. 1989 is when this thing came out. Greg Gordon. And what we have is pretty much all the pertinent stuff that came from the three movies. By this time, the third movie had been in numerous books and comic book series had been in publication and circulation, and a growing number of interesting stuff we would have wanted to know. And this covers most of the Empire as we know it. So the introduction, the source book, Prologue to Might of the Empire, Chapter 1, a primer on Imperial power, Rise of the Senator, the New Order, Rise of the Palatine, the New Order, Structure of the Empire. Take in mind, this was written prior to the next trequel, a trilogy of movies. So anything that was taken or was added to canon from Attack of the Phantom Menace up forward would be amended. So this would be considered outdated from some perspective. But there's a lot of interesting material that still works together. And I'm confident there's actually material here that predates the prequels, and the writers of those prequels had access to much of what is now considered legend material, but would have been beta canon at best, and they still make it in there. The Juggernaut is a grand example of something that makes it into the movies and into the actual canon from a non-canon source. And there's a lot of that going on, right? It hits in this. So we got the structure of the Empire, citizenry laws, planetary governments, the governors, sectors, moffs, grand moffs, their roles, servants, the advisor, emperor advisors, imperial guard, the emperor himself, grasp of empire, control of information, the initial communicate to the emperor suggesting the construction of the Death Star, which we now know was in the works long before Palatine takes power, or some sort of version thereof of it was being developed and potentially constructed many years before this. So this probably either needs to be amended or discarded. Chapter 2, Compnor, the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order. A special division of people. It says here, one of the emperor's advisors saw the potential worth of a populist movement which can be molded into a useful political tool. Overt encouragement and discreet funding were provided. So he gave Compnor the resources to grow. The emperor took a hand in shaping the organization. His methods were patient, defeating his opponents within Compnor, not through violence or threats, but hidden, gentle, consistent pressure, which wore the opposition down, etc., etc. Compnor actively attempts to build on the ethic of the New Order into the life of the average galactic citizen. Compnor is also recruiting young beings in huge numbers in order to ensure that future citizens will consider the old Republic a relic of the past and committing their lives totally to the New Order. Select committee, and various groups within it and their purposes. Some of them are quite nefarious. I found this stuff to be excellent source material for lots of little sidebar adventures in the campaigns I've ran or conceived of over the decades for Star Wars. Imperial ISB, created to increase the Imperial's knowledge of political events. See, even before it became popular in the books, or because of this, inspired some of the material that the writers used in the legend books where we're dealing with ISB, etc., etc. It even carries forward to new canon and into some of the bits and pieces into the movies. Chapter 3, Imperial intelligence and how it functions and what its purpose is, and various branches within and what they do, and it's quite extensive. Lots of stuff. Imperial operations, surveillance, infiltration, interrogation, and bunch of acronym stuff here that you got to really get into. Assassination, intelligence, external communications, sedition, crisis, sector plexus, the plexus droid vessels, how they communicated and had a private network of hyperspace capable ships and satellites to keep the Empire firmly locked down. Then we got Imperial rank insignia, how to understand what them doodads on their chests were. They have a breakdown of stormtrooper armor, various specialties. Chapter 4 is about the military, the Navy, changes from the old Republic to the New Republic, naval personnel, basic concept of their uniforms and equipment, the Army. It's not really until we see Solo do we get a taste of what the Imperial Army would have been ideally like. Which, it's kind of understandable because in the early days, most of us made the assumption that the stormtroopers were the equivalent of the Marines and the Army and whatever the Empire needed. But the reality of the fact that even with this vast stormtrooper corps, to have the need for boots on the ground on countless worlds, the galaxy over, would warrant the need of an army. And so we see what an army uniform looks like from Solo. We've seen brief, we know that brief views of these things in the movies and over time, and mentions in the books and novels, but it just really starts to takes on a new agenda with Solo, in my opinion. Right? So the equipment, the stormtroopers, how they play out. Technically, that they're not part of the army. They are kind of like, and I don't like using the comparison, but if you look at the Wehrmacht of Nazi Germany during World War II, the Nazi Germany's had the SS divisions, which were different from the Wehrmacht. They worked parts and parcel together, but they were treated different. They had better access to resources, and they had more fanatical people. Just giving that out there. So we got Chapter 5, Capital Ships. This is where we see new vessels appear that later appear in the movies. Here's your skip ray blast boat, patrol craft, strike cruisers, assault shuttle here, escort carriers, a lancer, indictors. All these came out, for the most part, in game-related material and then made their way into the actual canon and stories of the Star Wars universe. There's a few here, like the torpedo sphere and the armored freighter that doesn't see a bunch. I don't think it's ever been appeared. I can't say that 100%, but so we see the breakdown of different Star Destroyers and Super Star Destroyers. Nice little recognition. What I like about this is here we got a comparison, and then they have the Super Star Destroyer there in the background. It just keeps right on going for several pages to give you a really effective idea. It goes on like 6 pages how long this thing is. Chapter 6, custom ordnance, cloaking fields, hyperspace pulse generators, magnetic bombards, two-wave gravity shock devices, orbital night cloaks, visual electronic intensifiers. Chapter 7 are land vehicles. The very first one is Juggernaut. And like I said, this is a fanfic or game design concept that makes its way into the movie canon and not the other way around, which is gives credence to my belief that those people who were writing had access to all this information, and some of them probably grew up with it like we did or like I did playing the game, and wanted to encourage the use of whatever possible of some interesting stuff. Obviously there's a bunch of single things here that didn't quite make it in. Didn't have a reason for it, but it doesn't fact that the fact is they still would be there. Here's our breakdown of our TIE fighter concepts. A anti-grav version of an AT-AT, command speeder, hover scout. Breakdown. Chapter 8, sector group organization. So a sector group is a huge gathering of Imperial might. Military might. A sector group is flexible enough organization which is rarely reinforced many times to its original strength while retaining essentially the same command structure at all times. This flexibility is an integral part of the Emperor's plan to fully arm the Empire. So we got roles of the Army and Navy within a sector group, role of the Army, role of the Navy, organization of the Army from the squad level up, augmented squads, platoons, augmented platoons, companies, how they communicate with each other, augmenting companies and larger units. Even got a brief entry on the mouse droid, how it became such an integral part of the Navy and Army of the Empire. Battalion, regiment, battle group, Army at the battalion level, corps, Army, system Army, sector Army, Army level, organization of the Navy's mission detail, ship command, the line, commanded by a captain of the line. The line's most amorphous level of organization in the Navy. Theory line should have 4 ships, but percentage of lines that actually have 4 ships is about 7%. Lines vary from as few as 1 ship to 20 or even more if circumstances warrant. Stormtroopers in the order of battle, military folklore, sector group at the squadron level, squadrons, salvagers run. System force, full might of the Empire, fleet. Sector group, order of battle and future growth of the Army. Sector group, headquarter level. Chapter 9, combat artillery. Artillery is kind of a hit or miss thing in the Star Wars universe. They have stuff that you use for offensive, defensive purposes, but true artillery, as in the way we understand how artillery works, is a little bit more convoluted or a little less defined, and I think in part is because technology in the Star Wars universe is vastly different from our real world equivalents. Starting with, they don't use a lot of ballistic weapon systems, so true artillery firing from line of sight only takes on a different kind of role than the ability to fire in an arc from a distance, from cover, etc. Also, because the sheer number of capital ships and space assets, if you really want to subjugate a world and you need artillery on a regular basis, you either put a fleet in orbit or you put a fleet of battle stations or even armed satellites that can provide that firepower, that ground support mission that can, and then you augment that with aircraft. So I mean, it's just one of the reasons. So one of the reasons why so much of the quote artillery equipment in here is so convoluted. A lot of it's outdated by most standards. Unless you're talking, given the heavy ion cannon we see in action at the Battle of Hoth might be an exception to the rule because of its role and how it functions. But having planetary turbo laser batteries to defend against the space, while they qualify as artillery, are not really artillery in the strictest sense. It's like missile launchers. It's not until Rogue One do we get a good look at a regular use of shoulder-fired missile launchers in the movie, but the implication was they've been there all along. It's just that they're very specialized. They use either lower tech civilizations make use of these things because they're just hard to ion or laser-based, energy-based weaponry is far superior in most people's mindsets in this kind of world setting. But we do see the existence of field missile launchers and grenade launchers. They do exist. So we got heavy anti-vehicle weapons, turbo laser emplacements. And we got infantry support weapons. Once again, shoulder mount launch. There's an ion cannon, which portable missile launcher, specific projectile launcher, specific. So the projectile launcher would be this multi-tool for containing smoke, gas, chemical agents, and possibly even explosive rounds to give you a variety of things that you can use in indirect fire or against large groups of opponents. Thermal detonators, heavy repeating blasters, force pikes. That's another thing. You don't see the real world equivalent too much in the Star Wars universe is the use of light to heavy repeating weapons, basically machine guns, because the energy capability of most rifles and carbines have settings that allow them for multi-fire. The need for this heavier version of that is not necessarily useful in a lot of scenarios. If we're talking boarding actions aboard ships and inside facilities, things like this, it's when you get to the Army concept of world conquer, world or holding territory, do those sort of weapons really start to play? And then you might see them augmenting platoons or squads, but having squads, of stormtroopers running around with these things. Even in the movies, we only see them in a couple critical spots. They bring in an E-web and set it up in the hangar bay with the idea of taking out any more of these ships that are trying to get away, and thus the this segment where the Millennium Falcon's secondary defense weapons opens up on this E-web squad as they're setting up. The second thing, of course, being here and there. They're mostly designed for defensive operations and not the other way around. It's not the same as modern equivalents, but that's to be expected, right? All right, so proton mines, sharpshooter blasters, nice color stuff, and some artist renditions of various things, various battles, and so on and so forth. We get Chapter 11, Special Military Forces. See, the Stormtroopers are the elite of the Empire's military machine, trained in a wide variety of roles. Stormtroopers carry out any task quickly and effectively. They provide support for the two arms of the Empire's military establishment, the ground forces and the Imperial fleet. Stormtroopers are highly trained, highly motivated. Now, everything you have read, everything we read about how well trained and well equipped the Stormtroopers are. And you see this better in the Clone Wars when you see the ARC troopers, for example, and their capabilities. That the average clone trooper is much more lethal than a stormtrooper is kind of retarded. It doesn't do any good for the movies if a handful of stormtroopers suddenly go gung ho and decimate the heroes. Right, and so when we see the Battle of Hoth, the snow troopers that are invading the rebel base, this is an elite crack unit. And even they seem to not be able to shoot very well. When we see the boarding party from New Hope engaging the rebels, at this point you actually get a better sense of just how effective these people are. And they clear the corridors pretty fast. They force the rebel defenders to fall back quickly. They press the attack, and their hit ratio tends to be a little higher, except when they run up against the heroes of the movies, which is kind of how it plays out in our role-playing games too. Our characters are the heroes. These are the people who stand above the average. So the average Joe soldier going up against a stormtrooper is going to be hard-pressed. Now, the Rebel Alliance, a lot of their soldiers are already veteran and are elite before they joined, and those that are not are whittled out pretty fast because they just, and then the rebellion cannot, the alliance simply cannot hold territory the way the Empire can. So having mass groups of armies on the sector level, planetary level, things like that would be like in Solo. We see a planetary society of people contesting the Empire's control of their planet, and that is not the rebellion fighting. That is just the local population defending their home world, trying to drive out the Imperials, which at the end of the day, they're not going to succeed. Just saying. right? So we get into deployment, death of a rebel base, nice walk through there. Elite armory units, organizations, battalion organizations, some stories, scimitar assault wing, an elite bomber wing for the Empire, various recon flights, the Navy, the Academy, basic training, branches, so on and so forth. So there you have it. A very useful, very interesting, very entertaining read. The Star Wars Imperial source book.